Hello and welcome to A Novel Idea, the show where we interview authors. My name is Noelle Boc. I am your host, and today we are welcoming Melissa Ludtke.
Well, thank you for welcoming me, and I just love the idea that you set aside time for books.
Oh.
It's fabulous.
Well, I am a librarian too,
Yeah.
so you know.
Yeah. Well, that's
I'm
one of
always
the.
setting
my
aside
goodness,
time for books.
our world would be a very different place without librarians.
So,
thank you.
I almost want to, like do a little bow down to you because, honestly, I did not know anything about this case or anything when I read it. I always still think the 70s are not that long ago, but it's 50
living.
years.
I'm living, so I mean,
Right?
it wasn't that long ago.
I know, yeah, but 50 years though is like almost 50 years is a long time. Like that's a long time.
It was only when young people started getting interested in my case, maybe within the last decade or so, that I realized that I was history.
Right?
That's a different notion of yourself than sort of just continuing to live your life, that you actually represent something that happened in what people who are alive today think of as history. So I guess you become living history, and that was one of the impetuses to actually write the book.
Yeah, so that was one of my questions too. Was there something that kind of was the catalyst to get you going to start writing it?
I think it was that. I mean, raising a daughter obviously got me thinking about the history that she doesn't know, and it's not for lack of, her interest in it. It's just that there's only a certain number of things that get taught.
In the book, it sounded like, basically you got to this point where there was no choice, right? But to go to court at this point because you were being barred from the locker rooms for baseball and there was nothing else to really do. But it sounded like you kind of got dropped into that case. Like, okay, now it's going to be, you versus baseball. And you didn't sound, you sounded like you're, most excellent lawyer. Fritz sounded fantastic.
Yes.
For sure. But you didn't sound like you got really a lot of other support as far as how to deal with what was happening.
Well, no, I really got very little support from people, at the magazine. In part, and I want to say in part, it was my fault because I think that I hid from people a lot of the pain and the frustrations that I was dealing with. I think my way of handling sort of the stress that I really did feel as becoming a plaintiff in this case, in which really in the court of public opinion, unlike the court of law, the views of this case were that I was an immoral woman, or girl as they called me, who was going to court so that I could go into Major League Baseball locker rooms so that I could leer at naked athletes. To sum up the coverage that really almost fits volumes, that would be it.
Right.
And we didn't have social media at the time. There wasn't really a way for me to respond to what was being said about me. And what I did is I really just poured myself into work, perhaps as a distraction from feeling the way I did about the characterization of me, for putting my name on a lawsuit as a plaintiff, as the named plaintiff, when really I did that, and it sounds kind of almost silly compared to the other narrative and certainly more boring, but I did it because I had a job I loved, which was covering Major League Baseball for the world's leading sports magazine. And it was a job that I wanted to be able to fully perform. And that means that I wanted to have the same opportunities to do this job as my male colleagues had. So my pressing to be able to go into the locker room wasn't to go into the locker room, it was to be able to interview the athletes that I had no other access to. How was I going to do the job of covering these games and these athletes if I didn't have access to talk to them? And in fact, the men did. So it was a clear disadvantage that I was dealing with.
Yes.
So wanting to do my job was the reason I put my name on it, but I was quickly disillusioned by the idea that that was going to be the focus of anyone else in their coverage of this, of my lawsuit.
Now, do you feel, obviously a lot of years have gone by,
Yeah.
but what do you feel like you carry with you from that experience now? I mean, obviously you had a lot of name calling and, you know, being infantilized and all sorts of things like that. Like, what do you still think about that? You know, looking back on it now, like, what's still with you?
Well, I think I have two responses to that. One has been prompted by going into classrooms and talking with college students about this experience, people who are thinking about sports journalism or sports media, you know, as their path forward. And a lot of the young women, you know, ask me sort of how I dealt with it. And what I tell them is that, first of all, I didn't really have a mentor who I could turn to.
Right.
I encouraged them to find that. You know, being the only woman covering baseball in the country full time didn't lend itself to finding someone else who had done this before who could be a mentor for me. And even within the magazine, I really didn't turn to anyone in particular to play that role. The second thing I did is I made a terrible mistake in light of the pressure on me. And that was that I met a man early on as this lawsuit was beginning and the coverage was sort of coming at me and targeting me. And I had sort of I guess you could call it a whirlwind romance, but so whirlwind that within about a month of meeting him, I said I'd marry him. And this was a decision that I made that my closest friends just said, how could you be thinking of doing this? This is nuts. And instead of listening to them, I pushed that circle of trusted friends away. And so the second thing I say to young people today is, you know, don't do that. Don't push aside, you know, for any reason, the people who are your most trusted friends, to whom you can say anything and know that, one, it's protected, and two, that they will give you honest feedback. And so once I'd lost that circle of friends, I really felt, I think, more lonely than I ever should have in the process of going through it. So that's one side. The other side is that I feel enormous pride at having contributed in some, you know, what I considered to be at the time some small way to what was the much larger women's movement of that day, which was really about standing up to push down barriers that stood in the way of equal opportunity for us. That was an era in which I looked outside of myself and saw a lot of really courageous women. First of all, courageous women who had sort of founded the women's movement to start with, and women who were really pushing that movement, who were organizing the marches, organizing the protests, organizing the organizations that would change things through Congress, change things through going into court. I saw myself as one among many, you know, who did that. But in retrospect, as I've seen perhaps the impact that this case has on people for whom I talk about it, it's accessible. They can relate to my story. They can see themselves or see their daughters or their granddaughters who now play sports and still face some of the challenges, because sports is still very male-dominated.
Yes.
It's very much thought of through the male lens. So it's still an issue. So I think that there's a certain pride that I come away feeling that I didn't necessarily allow myself to feel back in the day.
That's good. Well, I'm glad that that's where you've come to, right? Because I was partially traumatized on your
going
behalf.
Through it.
Like reading that and just
you were saying, don't marry him, don't marry him.
Yeah, I was like, definitely don't marry him. I mean, and you knew that you knew on some level, right? But like that was you trying to protect yourself.
I was,
right?
So,
in some way, shape, or form. And you know, I don't think there's probably a woman alive who can't tell a story of how they feel like they have encountered some kinds of prejudice or you know, now we never say chauvinistic anymore, right? Like that term
male
is gone,
chauvinist was
right?
the term of the day in the 1970s. There was an awful lot of that. showing up in coverage of my case when I went back and, of course, read, hundreds of articles that were written about it at the time. Women's liber was a very big term.
Right,
that
yep.
was a derogatory term that was put with me. And male chauvinist as men sort of saying, well, you might call me a male chauvinist, but here's how I feel. And then
Right.
they would kind of go on with their spiel about me. So yes, there are some old-fashioned terms, but the sentiments that go behind them and the actions that go behind them are still very much present for a lot of young women who want to really move into the sports arena today.
Yeah, and I think that's just a very,
Yeah.
like I guess like reading that, I'm just like, no. And I haven't gone to look up anything historically yet, but just the examples you have of, newspaper headlines, the little comics that people did or whatever.
The cartoonists. We don't
Horrifying.
have so many cartoonists today because we don't have so many newspapers today, and many of them don't pay, for a cartoonist to be part of it. But that was just routine back then.
Right.
And so I say the two people who really benefited from my lawsuit were cartoonists and headline writers.
Right.
Because the men who sat on the copy desk at the time, who got to write the headlines, I mean, the idea that they could play around with baseball language and also with sexual puns and mix the two together was an absolute heyday for them.
Right.
Not so much for me.
Nope.
But for them, it was fabulous.
Yeah. I was horrified.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to take a quick break so you can
Okay.
read a little bit from your book.
Fabulous.
And then we'll be right back.
Okay.
All right.
I was 4 days old when my grandfather in Milton rolled a sheet of lightweight paper into his typewriter and wrote to my mom. "My dearest Jean," his 2-page single-spaced letter began. And after declaring me a smart girl, he misspelled my name, but expressed his excitement at my birth. Quickly, however, he transitioned to the vital news of his day. The Red Sox had swept the Yankees. As a teenager, my mom had been his Fenway Park seatmate, and their baseball bond endured their separation. From afar, he typed his rat-a-tat-tat play-by-play account of the Red Sox's doubleheader win that had sent the Yankees on their way to Detroit. "Well, we were thinking of you, and in fact, we've been doing so ever since the event, my birth. And yesterday, from 1:30 on, we were listening to the Red Sox wang the Yanks twice in a row. Well, what a ball game that first one was. 15 innings, and some job of relief pitching Scarborough did. When the Yanks came up with those 7 runs in the 7th inning, well, they made the score 6-10. With 2 innings to go, we thought it was about all over. But when Ted Williams hit that home run in the last of the 8th, well, we thought this time the Yanks were in for a real battle, and they were. They just couldn't get Ted to hit the ball where they were ganged up on him. He's been hitting the ball a lot to left field the last 2 weeks, and the Yanks gave up shifting for him, and then he banged it on to right and center and all over the plate." Well, when I found this letter in my mom's papers, his words just affirmed my visceral connection with baseball. But when I was born in 1951, the notion that I or any girl would grow up to cover Major League Baseball for the world's leading sports magazine was so laughably absurd as to be out of the realm of possibility. Well, my mom's pedigree as a baseball fan had given me a running start, but the odds that my life would turn out as it did were slim to none that day when her Fenway Park seatmate welcomed me into the family. It was 7 years later that my mom took me to my first baseball game at Fenway Park. As we fell in with a crowd of people pressing through the short passageway leading us into the ballpark, my mom squeezed my hand tightly. And when we emerged into that old ballpark, I tugged her hand to tell my mom to stop. I turned my head slowly to take in the full measure of the compact ballpark until my eyes settled on its pristine pristinely mowed grass shimmering in the afternoon's bright sun. I admired, too, its finely combed infield dirt. And when we walked to our grandstand seats near third base, the park's towering left field wall with its embedded scoreboard seemed enormous. I'd seen this so-called green monster on TV, but being this close was magical. Soon after my mom and I reached our seats that day, I went as close to the field as I could get and leaned over the low wall as far as I could to try to touch the field. I couldn't, but I wanted to try. And years later, with Sports Illustrated, whenever I was at Fenway Park, I reached down to touch the grass, rekindling joyful memories of my first game. Baseball hooked me that first day, and it never let go.
So let's talk a little about that lovely baseball commissioner.
Okay.
So it's Bowie Kuhn, right?
Bowie Kuhn, yes.
Bowie Kuhn.
Yeah.
So I actually did not realize, and I guess that's just, I know that there's always been a Major League Baseball commissioner, not always, but that I didn't realize that came out of the Black Sox scandal. Yeah. And I didn't realize how much immense power that person has over the league. Like I just didn't realize.
Well, that was the deal the men cut, after in the wake of the Black Sox scandal, which, could potentially have really brought baseball down. But baseball's reaction to it was to say, okay, we will bring in someone who's really going to have accountability for how this game is played. And they looked outside of baseball and they found Judge Landis. And Judge Landis, the only terms under which he would come in were the ones that baseball had to agree to. And that was to give him, and then consequently any commissioner who followed him, absolute authority over all of the teams and the team owners. And they inserted the clause, the best interests of baseball. And that was basically to say that this commissioner could make a ruling based on what he alone considered, to be in the best interests of baseball.
And so Kuhn decides that it is the best interest of baseball to not allow a woman to be able to come into
the clubhouse. Right.
And that was just his absolute decree, and there was no compromise that he wanted to make. Now, did you ever get to talk to him?
Never spoke with him. We only communicated, if you could call it a one-way communication, when the senior editor of baseball, who was to go into negotiations with Kuhn after I was banned, asked me to write him 2 letters that would be in the form of a memo. Mm-hmm. So we would have down sort of the facts of the night game 1 of the 1977 World Series, where Kuhn had issued his dictum, his edict, that I and any other woman who showed up would never be allowed to go into the clubhouse during the World Series and forever, was sort of how it was put to me. And then the second memo I wrote was after Game 6, and this had been after there had been some negotiations about how to potentially handle this situation outside of, legal action. And the solution they came up with for Game 6 was to give me a male escort. And that male escort was a public relations person for a different team, whose job it would be to run into the clubhouse after the Game 6 and to deliver players to me outside. Kuhn always contended in court and otherwise, that in the public realm as well, that he had made separate accommodations for women. Well, in my 2 years of covering baseball, I'd never been offered a separate accommodation by any PR person of any team. That was greenwashing. It didn't exist. And so his separate accommodation for me that night was the pleasure of standing out in the corridor with screaming fans after Reggie Jackson had hit 3 home runs to bring the World Series championship back to the New York Yankees. So not only was I pressed up against a concrete wall next to the clubhouse door, where I had the wonderful view of seeing men who didn't have the credential I had, which gave me access to the clubhouse, walking freely in and out, while I stood outside with a cacophony of just fans screaming. They'd come in through the dugout tunnel were standing there. There were police around, etc. And had Larry Shank, who was my male escort, perfectly wonderful man, actually delivered any players to me who played in the game, which he was unable to do in an hour and 45 minutes. He did bring out 2 players who had not played in the game. But had I wanted to ask them a question, they would not have heard the question I was asking them, nor would I have heard the answer. So that was Kuhn's notion of separate will be equal.
Right. And we know
That
separate
was
is never equal.
Separate was not equal. That was a determination of the Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. And in fact, it was the law of the land. So he may have felt that he could get away with that in the court of public opinion. What he couldn't get away with it in was the court of law, because it was very clear that separate is not equal. And that was a determination that the judge made really when we were able to turn to the 14th Amendment, which was the Equal Protection Clause, which she ruled on along with due process. So the arguments that won for him, the argument in the court of public opinion, were responsible for him losing, in a court of law.
And I was interested in the book that Weirs, right? Did you say Weirs?
Bob Weirs, who was
Weirs.
his lieutenant.
Lieutenant, I was going to say,
Yes.
what do we call him? Second in command.
Media director
Media
for
director.
baseball. Yeah.
You did speak to him while you were doing this book, right? Like you
I called
him.
him. It was I actually took out from the book because I had to, reduce its size. You always do in editing. So I took out our correspondence that we'd had prior to this call. But it was really rather tortured, me emailing him and asking if I could do a phone call, and him clearly not wanting to do it. But eventually, I do talk with him by phone once. That is correct, to kind of just go back over what his thoughts were on the night that he was the one to deliver the message to me in the press box at Yankee Stadium.
And he had a different version of events.
He had a different memory, let us put it that way. And his memory, I found, was enhanced. I mean, he had some sense that I had been set up by the men at Sports Illustrated to challenge baseball on that night. It was as though he portrayed me, and I think I write this in the book, as though I was the men's marionette, and I was sort of dangled up here to somehow take advantage of this world stage that we were on with this World Series with the 2 largest media markets. And I was, in fact, going to challenge baseball. He couldn't have been more wrong. I never, ever had any guidance or advice from anyone at Sports Illustrated how I should cover baseball. I had to learn it on my own. I did it on my own. Whatever access I was managed to get before the World Series, I'd done on my own. And Sports Illustrated had no idea when I went up on the workout day on Monday or on Tuesday for that first game, that I even at that point had access to the Yankees clubhouse because they had already okayed it, or that I had asked permission of the Dodgers. This is something I did on my own, which I had done under the radar screen on my own for 2 years. So he was so completely off base in his memory, but that's, I think, how he wanted to see it. That somehow there was this larger sort of conspiracy that I was a sort of small player in, that the men were using me to make a point. Wasn't the case at all.
Right. They always like to say, right, that as soon as you start telling the story, you change it, right, because you need to justify. You start justifying things, or
so
whatever.
It was very odd to hear him say it, and I just felt like I needed to put that in the book to just give a sense of how. I think it was reflective of how neither he nor Kuhn, I know Kuhn, never got over this loss in court, because really he had never been defeated before in court. It was a stinging loss for him. And I think Weirs and he believed that they could defeat me and should defeat me, and that they never really understood how it was that that we, meaning Time Incorporated, myself as the plaintiff, had won this case, and this in fact would be the new media policy for baseball over time. It took until Kuhn actually left he was fired. Let's put it that way. The only way you leave being a commissioner, you're either fired by the owners or you die. So he hadn't died, so he was fired by the owners. And Peter Ueberroth, who had run the 1984 LA Olympics and gotten great applause and praise for how he'd actually made a profit doing the LA Olympics and run them beautifully, became the baseball commissioner. And it was his first press conference, one of his first press conferences, that he changed Kuhn's policy from being, well, you know, as teams, I might encourage you to go by what happened in this court decision that only affected Yankee Stadium. But Ueberroth, responding to some of the problems that had existed with women continuing to be thrown out of clubhouses, et cetera, finally made it a mandate that every team would provide equal access to the clubhouses for the purpose of interviewing the athletes.
Did you correct Weirs when you spoke?
No.
You just like took his story and then just like,
it wasn't a call where I was calling him to argue a point.
Right.
It was really a call to just ask him what did he remember.
Well, the time always flies by when I'm doing these interviews. So we're already done. But I always have a last question, which is, do you have a library card?
I do have a library card. I have a library card, and I've had one ever since I moved to Cambridge in 1985. And in that time, our library has gotten twice as big, the Cambridge Public Library.
Yeah.
And we belong to the Middlesex Network, which is even more fabulous because we can get books from any number of libraries, which opens up the potential for finding a book, makes it a lot more wonderful. The other thing I will say, that as a former employee at Harvard University, I stayed long enough that when I left employee, I now have a Harvard ID that also gets me into the Widener Library and all of the libraries there. So I am libraried up.
Fantastic.
And I love them. I love them.
Everybody should be.
Great.
Well, thank you again, Melissa, for coming. I so much appreciate your time. And say it was a fascinating book. Like, there's lots of things that I did not know, so I feel richer for having read it. And I hope that, you know, we still continue making strides for women in sports as we move forward.
Well, thank you, Noelle. And I would just say that it is sort of that holiday time.
Yes.
And I have found that in the book readings that I've done around the country, that I sign books often, and people don't ask me to sign them for myself. They want me to sign them for a particular young woman in their life as a gift. They say, I want to give this to my niece or my daughter or my granddaughter, you know, who plays sports today. And so if anyone's thinking about doing that and they would like me to sign a book plate for you, I'm sure that you could come back to your public access station, ask them for my email, and I'm more than happy to send you a book plate.
Oh, that's
so
a very
yes,
kind offer.
I've gotten a number of book plates, and they're kind of custom made, so they might be kind of fun. So if anyone wants that, I'm more than happy to do it.
Oh, thank you so much. That's wonderful. That's a great thing to do, and makes, you know, something just that
makes
much
it
more
a little
treasured.
more special.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Well, and thank you all for watching this episode of A Novel Idea, and we'll see you again next time.